So happy Tuesday. Welcome to this July 7th Davecast as we continue in our study of the book of Exodus. We are all the way up now to chapter 16. And so let's get started today by picking up that last verse of 15 just to give us some context. It's verse 27. And it says, "Then they came to Elim where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water." And now we turn the page to chapter 16, and it's going to tell us that after they camped and they've gotten enough water, that they set out again. And so starting with 16:1, it says, "The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt." And so I put up this map and we can see their route. And first you'll see there on the bottom left where they've come from. And remember, there it's there in the green. Remember, we had this whole story of when they came to Marah and the bitter water they found that wasn't drinkable. But we also learned then about the great need of water for this huge group, maybe a couple of million people that are traveling together. And so it's significant that when they get to Elim, there are 12 springs there, abundant water for their needs. And so now they are setting out in the direction of Mount Sinai, as you can see. And spoiler alert, that's where Moses will receive the 10 Commandments. But this route takes them through the wilderness of Sin, that is the dotted line right in the middle of the map. And what we're going to see now for a while in our study is that wandering in the wilderness is pretty much going to be the norm for the Israelites for the next 40 years. I think I mentioned to you before, but the word Exodus comes from a Greek word that means the way out of slavery, the way toward freedom. And so it's important to note, I think, that this way out cuts right through the wilderness. And of course, there's great symbolism for us here. And I remind you, going back a couple of episodes, of something that happened just before they crossed the Red Sea. And you might remember when they found themselves there, they're surrounded by mountains on either side, can't go that way. Water is in front of them, the Red Sea. Pharaoh's armies hot on their trail behind them. And sometimes we find ourselves in those kinds of situations like they did, where the only way out is through. And in that case, with this Red Sea being the immediate obstacle, oftentimes in our walk in faith, we come to these immediate obstacles that we've got to cross. If we're going to go forward, we must go through it in our lives as we go follow God. And so I said that sometimes the way out is through. But it's immediate. It's something we have to deal with right then. And it often takes this leap of faith. But here in the desert, the way out takes them through the wilderness. And so it is for us too, metaphorically. For the Israelites, the wilderness is extremely important to their Exodus story. The wilderness very much becomes the birthplace of Israel as a people, where they came together. It's where their identity and theology as people are formed in this 40 years in this wilderness. It's in the wilderness where they come to know Yahweh, the one true God, the God of Abraham and Sarah and Jacob and all their ancestors. It's in the wilderness. It's in the wilderness where they come to know God's way and God's will. The wilderness is really where they come to know God personally. Not God just as a set of beliefs or ideas, but God personally. And so facing obstacles and facing wilderness are two very different places to be. And both are difficult for sure. But obstacles are immediate and they're more fight or flight in nature because they require us to take an immediate leap of faith. But being in the wilderness, man, that requires a different kind of faith and trust. You ever found yourself in the wilderness as you're following God? Because if you do, you are not alone. We all go through it. And I believe we could make a strong case that God is most profound profoundly known and experienced in those wilderness places. Whenever we find ourselves in what feels like a wilderness, when we find ourselves in this holy, scary threshold place between what was and what shall be, between the past and the future, between death and resurrection, that is often where faith really takes hold of us and forms us and transforms us. But it isn't easy. But God never said it would be easy, right? God said it would be worth it. And so watch now the reaction of the Israelites, because I believe it is very much the human reaction that we all have when we are in the wilderness. And that is to have our minds to play tricks and make us long for the place back with bondage and slavery that we've just left. Because that's exactly what we see in the Israelites as they continue in the next verses. So picking up with verse 2. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. Not some of the community, not half the community, the whole community grumbled. And the Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and we ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Now, what's becoming quite clear to the Hebrew people out there in the desolate wilderness is that life wasn't suddenly going to be easy, and that freedom itself had its own set of huge challenges. And there is this undeniable tension between the security of slavery and the gift of freedom. So the Israelites' memory begins to play tricks on them. And they said, hey, back in Egypt, sure we were in slavery. Sure life was kind of hard. Well, it was pretty difficult, but at least our stomachs were full. Life was so much better back in those days, back there in slavery. And that can be the same for us. When our faith walk takes us through hot, dry stretches where there seems to be no end in sight, we can have that same kind of experience. So watch what happens next in verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. I will test them." I will test them. That's important. It's not just provision. It's also a test to expose their weakness and help them grow stronger in trust. And God gives them some specific instructions just how they are to gather this bread for the Sabbath, continuing in verse 5. On the sixth day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You know that it was the Lord when he gives you the meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." And then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" And while Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. And so right here we have what they call a theophany. God being in the pillar of fire at night and on the pillar of a cloud by day. That's a theophany, being a visible manifestation to humankind of God. And so it just comes right at the right moment there in that text. And so we have that manifestation of God. And then in verse 11 it says, the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. And that evening, quail came and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread of the Lord. The Lord has given you to eat." Now, you probably have heard this before, but they called this thin, flaky stuff manna. And manna literally means, what is it? And so, see this stuff, what is it? So that's what they named it. But watch this now with the manna. Because God gives them specific instructions. Don't miss this. There is a big faith lesson to be learned here. God's provision brings with it testing. We tend to think that the test is waiting on God to provide. And while that is kind of a test, the testing is far from over with just the quail and the manna. The purpose of testing is to expose and to train, to expose Israel's actual level of trust and commitment and obedience, and to train them to trust God more and more. And so listen to what comes next. Verse 16, this is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. Now, my understanding is that an omer was a dry unit of measure that was equivalent, what our equivalent would be about 9 cups, a couple of quarts of this dry stuff. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. And then Moses said to them, "No one is to keep any of it until morning." However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. And so Moses was angry with them. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person, and the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any." Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day He gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out." And so the people rested on the 7th day. And just a quick insert. Not only is this story a wonderful illustration of God's promise of provision, give us our daily bread, it also illustrates the importance of the rhythm of our life in God. And the rhythms of religious observance, daily prayer, weekly worship, for example, those observance is how we bring order to the chaos of the wilderness. If we find ourselves in the metaphorical desert, one of the ways through those times is to get connected with God's rhythm of worship and Sabbath keeping. And that can bring order to the chaos. And so then verse 31. Then the people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. And so that's oddly specific there. And then kind of its forecasting of what's to come. Verse 35 tells us that the Israelite ate manna for 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. And so that brings us up to the end of 16. And so let me just briefly offer a little reflection on this for hopefully giving you some practical application of this section to our everyday lives. Although I think this kind of speaks for itself. But let me just offer this. I have on occasion have been known to watch the TV show Hoarders. I will confess that. And I will also confess that I can't stand the show. I honestly can't. But I can't stop watching it. It's rubbernecking. It's horrible to watch, but I just can't turn away. If you've never seen the show, Hoarders is about people that, hoard. And their houses and their garages and their storage bins are just filled with stuff. And a lot of it's just junk that doesn't make sense. But what we find out, apparently, hoarding is a kind of addiction. And many of the people who hoard are suffering from a condition that somewhere in their life they've lost something valuable to them. Maybe another person, a happy childhood, some other important part of their life. And so their inability to get rid of anything and their obsession to acquire more serves to fill in that hole left by that thing they've lost. And while I know it's real, and there are folks I know and suspect that I know who may have this condition, I don't pretend to understand the hoarding addiction. But I do believe that most of us in humans have a little bit of hoarder in us. It's so easy for me to relate to the Israelites here. Trying to take a couple of days of manna at a time. I mean, it almost seems like good planning, right? We're just making sure we're going to have enough. We're going to get organized here. And so despite God's repeated evidence of faithfulness, the Israelites still continued to doubt whether God would continue to provide. And isn't that just like us? We as human beings, we have those same temptations to grumble and complain, and also the same temptations to not trust, but to hoard, to not think God's going to provide. And there's this temptation to grab as much as we can now, because what if God doesn't give us what we need tomorrow? There is this temptation to take the many, many blessings that God gives us every day, to take them for granted. And then there's this temptation is if we ever find ourselves with our cupboards bare, is to doubt God and not trust God that He will provide for us. God promised the Israelites, gather as much as you need for today, and I will provide for tomorrow's needs tomorrow. And so I just want us to take a moment and consider how God has provided for our needs today, this day. Think about the many blessings God has given you, and how God keeps His promise to provide our daily bread. As God was with the Israelites in the wilderness, so God offers to be with us in our wilderness journey and responds to our deepest hungers, even when we, in all our humanity, get stuck in grumbling or doubt. God still offers His goodness and grace to us. And His goodness is nothing short of the bread for our souls and strength for our journey through the wilderness to the promised land. Well, we've gotten to the end for today, but I'll be back on Thursday at noon. And so until that time, keep bringing the hope. God bless.